New York, a city of endless opportunity, but also the breeding ground for corruption, violence, and unimaginable wealth. In the shadows, a few families fought for power, respect, and control, at any cost. But with great power comes an inevitable fall, and these families were no different. This was the world of the most notorious crime families, families whose names would forever be tied to the underworld, their stories written in blood. But who were these men, and what drove them to rule with such ruthlessness? Was it ambition, revenge, or something even darker? Tonight, we will uncover the stories of the rise and fall of these infamous crime families. From the streets of New York to the darkest corners of the world, we'll reveal how they built their empires and why they ultimately crumbled under the weight of their own greed. The birth of an empire. In the early 1900s, the city of New York was a land of dreams, but for many immigrants, it was also a place of hardship. The streets were filled with gangs, and the law was something you could pay to ignore. And from this chaos, a new breed of criminals emerged, Italian-American families who would grow to dominate the city's underworld. One name rose above the rest, a man whose ambition would carve his family's name into history, the Corleone family. But they weren't the only ones. Others would rise to challenge them, creating an empire of crime that spanned generations. The family tree. Key players. Let's begin with the Corleone family. Led by Vito Corleone, a man who rose from poverty to become the most feared man in New York. His rise was nothing short of legendary. A master of diplomacy and violence, he forged alliances, crushed enemies, and built a criminal empire. But Vito wasn't alone. Carlo Gambino, an associate turned boss, would become the face of the Mafia in the 1960s. He expanded his operations and established the Gambino family as the dominant force in New York. And then there was John Gotti, a man who would turn the Mafia into a brand. Charismatic, ruthless, and fearless. His rise to power was meteoric, and so was his fall. The grit and grind. But the rise of the Mafia wasn't just about power and money. It was about survival. These families were at war, not just with each other, but with the very government that sought to dismantle them. The streets became battlegrounds. The mob wars that raged in the 1950s and 1960s were some of the bloodiest the city had ever seen. And for every corrupt cop on their payroll, there was an FBI agent hunting them down. The war between law enforcement and organized crime reached a boiling point in the 1970s, as families like the Lucchese's, the Genovese's, and the Bonanno families fought for control of the streets. Betrayal and the fall. But every empire has its cracks. The very trait that allowed these families to rise, loyalty, was also the one that led to their downfall. It wasn't the cops or the FBI that would bring them down, but the men they trusted the most. In the case of the Gambino family, it was the loyalty of John Gotti that would come to an end when he turned on his own. His betrayal of Paul Castellano would seal his fate, and the family's. As the 1980s and 1990s rolled in, the era of the Mafia began to crumble. The old guard was being replaced with younger, more reckless minds, and with the rise of technology and the growing strength of law enforcement, it became harder and harder for these families to operate in the shadows. The legacy of the Mafia. But even today, the legacy of these families endures. In the movies, in the books, and in the rumors whispered in dark alleys, the Mafia still holds a grip on the imagination of the world. And though their reign may be over, their story is far from finished. The rise and fall of the most notorious crime families is a story of ambition, betrayal, and power. And though the Mafia may be a shadow of its former self, its impact on history and on New York will never be forgotten. The battle for control. The struggle for control over New York City's streets was relentless. Every decision was a battle. Every handshake a potential betrayal. The Mafia was a business, but unlike any other, it was built on violence, intimidation, and loyalty, all while remaining shrouded in secrecy. The Corleones controlled the heart of the city, but their grip was far from secure. The Gambino family, under the leadership of Carlo Gambino, fought relentlessly to take over the city's most lucrative territories. And then there were the Genovese family, always lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The betrayal that shook the Mafia world. But betrayal can come from anywhere, even those closest to you. And for the Gambino family, that betrayal came from within. In 1985, John Gotti orchestrated the murder of Paul Castellano, the head of the Gambino family. It was a move that sent shockwaves throughout the Mafia world. Gotti's audacity in taking down a sitting boss was unheard of. It wasn't just about control anymore, it was about dominance, about showing the world who was truly in charge. But Gotti's rise was as meteoric as it was reckless. His public persona, his ability to charm the media, made him a household name. He became the Dapper Don, a symbol of Mafia glory, and in some ways a celebrity in his own right. Yet, all the while, the shadows closed in. The war within. But Gotti wasn't the only one who had his eyes on power. As he ascended, the other families, those who had once been allies, began to plot their moves. The Lucchese family, always a quiet threat, watched from the sidelines. The Colombo family, divided by infighting, made its own plays for power. The Mafia, once a tightly knit network of alliances, began to splinter. Old alliances were broken, trust eroded. The wars weren't just fought in the streets, they were fought in the boardrooms, in the back rooms, behind closed doors, and all the while the law was closing in, using every trick in the book to bring them down. The rise of the FBI and the fall of the Mafia. As the 1980s came to a close, the law had learned from its mistakes. The FBI, now armed with new technologies, had begun to infiltrate the very heart of the Mafia. The use of wiretaps, informants, and surveillance allowed them to track the inner workings of the families in ways never before possible. The trials of Mafia bosses like John Gotti became the spectacle of the decade. Gotti's ability to avoid conviction in multiple trials earned him the nickname the Teflon Don. But even his luck would eventually run out. In 1992, Gotti was convicted of murder, racketeering, and other charges. His conviction marked the end of an era. The legacy of the Mafia. Today, the Mafia is a shadow of its former self. The families that once ruled the streets of New York are fractured, their power waning in the face of modern law enforcement and changing times. Yet, the legacy of these families endures in the stories, the movies, and the myths that continue to captivate us. The rise and fall of these families became more than just a criminal story. It became a part of American culture. The Mafia wasn't just about crime. It was about loyalty, betrayal, and power. It was a brutal, unforgiving world, but one that captured the imagination of millions. The end of an empire. For the families that once ruled New York, the end was inevitable. Gotti's conviction was just one piece of the puzzle. As the Mafia crumbled under the pressure of law enforcement and the rise of new criminal enterprises, it became clear, no empire, no matter how brutal, could last forever. And so the Mafia's legacy lives on, not in the streets, but in the stories we tell. Their rise was swift, their fall inevitable, but their impact, it can never be erased. This is the story of the rise and fall of the most notorious crime families. Their empire built on violence, loyalty, and power. A legacy written in blood, and one that will never be forgotten. If you found this video captivating, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the world of crime and history. Don't forget to hit the bell icon so you never miss a story. Until next time, keep your eyes open and your secrets closer.